The camp smelled like rotten hunger. 2,000 beings packed into a settlement built for 400, breathing recycled air that tasted of desperation and dust. And the silence between them was the worst kind, the silence of things that had given up. Rendai stood at the distribution table with the last case of nutrient blocks and counted heads. Not enough. She had not told them yet. The numbers were the same as yesterday, not enough, but yesterday. There had been hope that the supply ship would come. It did not come. The ship had not come in 11 days. The Galactic Council had issued a statement expressing concern. Concern, Rendai had learned, was what the powerful offered the suffering when they intended to do absolutely nothing. She was dividing the last block into fractions when the gate alarm chimed. Not the breach alarm, the gate alarm. Something had requested entry at the outer perimeter. Something, not someone. The scanner couldn't classify the biometric signature. He walked through the gate alone. No weapons visible. No identification chip broadcasting on any of the 12 standard galactic frequencies. No luggage, just a battered field kit slung over one shoulder, worn to the color of old bone. He was human. Rendai had seen humans before twice, from a distance, in news feeds and council dispatches. This one was lean and tall by human standards, a face that had been lived in hard, eyes the color of deep water beneath ice still on the surface, moving underneath. He did not look around the camp the way new arrivals usually did, cataloging exits, calculating threats, deciding whether this was safe. He looked around the camp the way a surgeon looks at a patient, assessing damage, deciding what to treat first. He walked directly to the only structure in the camp with a heat source still running, the derelict kitchen block that hadn't produced anything edible in 3 weeks. He set his field kit down on the counter. He looked at the broken nutrient processor. He looked at it for approximately 8 seconds. Then, without a word to anyone, without asking permission or explaining himself, he opened the field kit, selected tools no one on site could name, and began to take the machine apart. The camp medics gathered at the doorway. Rendai approached. "That processor requires parts we don't have," she said. Her translator rendered the tesserae clicks into standard galactic common. 3 technicians have tried. The model is 17 years old. The parts don't exist here. The human glanced up at her. He had very still eyes. "They exist," he said, and looked back at the machine. He had taken the housing off and was doing something inside that made 2 of the medics step closer in unwilling fascination. "Where do you keep your food stores?" She blinked. "Behind the secondary shelter, but show me when I'm done here," he said. Not a request, not rude, simply a man who had divided the next 4 hours into a sequence of tasks and was informing her which one came second. He went back to work. 2 hours and 40 minutes later, the nutrient processor hummed. Not the stuttering half-functional hum it had managed in its final days. It hummed cleanly, at a frequency that meant the calibration was better than factory new. The camp's senior medic stared at it. "What did he use?" Sovar asked, very quietly. Nobody answered. They had all watched him work, and none of them could entirely explain what they had seen. He had used components from his own kit, things that looked like cooking tools but clearly weren't only cooking tools. He was already in the food storage by then. He stood in the middle of it, turning slowly, taking inventory with his eyes the same way he had assessed the camp methodically, without judgment, simply noting what was true. Then he started to cook. The smell hit the far end of the camp in minutes, warm, complex, alive, in a way that processed nutrient blocks were not and had never been. It moved through the cramped corridors and the crowded shelters like something that had been missing for a very long time. They drifted toward it, all of them Tessari and Krelish, 3 species Rendai couldn't immediately name. A family of Velkari who had been sitting motionless against the eastern wall for 2 full days. They moved toward the kitchen the way living things move toward warmth. He fed every one of them. He served each species separately, different bowls, different temperatures, different nutrient compositions. He had asked Rendai for the camp's medical registry. She had given it to him without quite deciding to. He had read it in 12 minutes. He didn't eat until the last person had their bowl. Rendai noticed this. She watched him take a small portion, smaller than anything he had served anyone else, and eat it standing at the counter, eyes already on the storage inventory. Planning tomorrow. She approached him when the others had gone. The camp was quiet in a different way now, not the silence of exhaustion, but the silence of the fed. There was a profound difference between them. Rendai had spent 60 years learning to tell them apart. "What is your name?" she asked. He paused. Just briefly, a pause the length of a single breath held and released. In that pause, she caught his scent, and something in it made her go very still. She had no reference for it. Not grief, exactly. Something beneath grief. Something older, Cole, he said. Just that. No family name, no species designation, no homeworld offered. He turned back to the counter and began cleaning with the same quiet precision he had applied to everything else, methodical, thorough, and completely self-contained. Rendai stood very still for a long moment after that. Her species processed emotion through scent, reading the chemical language that living things produced without knowing, the involuntary honesty of biology. She had never encountered a human signature before. There was grief in it. She knew grief, cold and metallic, sharp as the edge of something broken. His grief was enormous, ancient, but beneath it, under layers of silence and smoke and the warm chemical residue of hours of cooking, something she had no word for. Not sorrow, not rage, something banked and very deep, the way fire survives inside stone long after the surface has gone cold. She filed it away. There were 2,000 hungry mouths to keep alive. She would think about it later. Over the next 6 days, Cole rebuilt the camp's food system entirely. This was not a figure of speech. He redesigned the storage rotation, cross-referenced 12 species' metabolic needs, and identified 3 nutrient deficiencies the camp's own medical team had missed. He learned the dietary biology of each species with a speed that quietly unsettled the medics. Not just learned, retained, applied, adapted on the fly. By the 3rd day, he was producing species-specific meals from a shared ingredient pool that should not have been able to yield them. "He's either a xenobiology researcher or he has access to databases we don't have," said Sova on the 4th morning, watching Cole sort protein compounds with the fluency of someone reading in their native language. "Which one is it?" No one knew. No one asked. On the 2nd morning, a Tesserae child appeared in the corner of the kitchen. Small, even by Tesserae standards, with enormous eyes that caught the light like polished dark stone, and a stillness about her that was different from quiet. She did not speak. Cole noticed her immediately. He said nothing. He didn't ask who she was or why she was there. He cooked. When the meal was ready, he set a single bowl on the floor in the corner where she sat, the way you leave water out for something wild. Then he walked away. Rendai, watching from the doorway, felt something move inside her chest. The second scent, her species' word for the emotional response to witnessing someone else's kindness. She had not felt it in a very long time. The camp had not given her reasons to. The child's name was Pick. Rendai told Cole that evening. She had not spoken in 3 months, not since she arrived at the gate alone, without parents, without explanation, and simply stopped making sounds. Cole listened to this with his back to Rendai, cleaning the stove. He said nothing. But the next morning, before Pick arrived, there was a bowl waiting in the corner. A different composition, Rendai checked. Adjusted for a child's specific metabolic needs, fractionally warmer than the adult portions. He had noticed she was cold. He had adjusted, without being asked, without saying a single word about it. Rendai stood in the kitchen doorway and found that the metallic edge of his grief scent had shifted slightly, not lessened, but something running alongside it now. Something that smelled like purpose. Krev watched the human differently from everyone else. The Krelish security chief had survived 30 years in deep-rim cargo hauling, which meant he had survived by reading people correctly and quickly. His mandibles clicked twice, the Krelish tell for unresolved concern, and stayed that way. It was the hands. Cole's hands moved through the kitchen with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had done precise repetitive tasks under severe pressure for many years. Cooks developed that quality. So did surgeons. So did soldiers. The knife grip bothered Krev most. He switched between grips without looking, a transition that took trained cooks years to develop and still required conscious thought. Cole did it the way you blink, the way you breathe, muscle memory so deep it had become autonomic. Those were not a chef's hands. "You worked in food service long?" Krev asked. On the 5th morning. His translator pushed Krelish clicks into Galactic Common with its usual mechanical delay. Cole was quartering root vegetables, his knife barely audible against the board, so controlled it was almost silent. Cole glanced at him long enough. He went back to the vegetables. The knife resumed its rhythm. Krev folded his secondary arms, the Krelish gesture of deliberate non-confrontation, and decided to leave it where it sat, because the camp was eating, and eating changed everything. 3 days ago, 2 Tesserae elders had been too weak to stand. Today they were distributing food alongside Rendai, a Krelish infant, flagged critical by the medics on arrival, had stabilized overnight. Whatever Cole Mercer was or wasn't, whatever those hands had been trained to do in some other life. In some other context entirely, the results of his presence were visible in the faces of 2,000 beings who had stopped looking at the floor when they walked. Krev kept his silence. It happened on the 7th morning. Cole was mid-chop, a rhythm he had maintained without variation for all 7 days. The sound of the knife against the board as regular as a heartbeat when he simply stopped. The knife stilled. His head turned toward the eastern perimeter wall. No one else reacted. There was nothing to react to. The camp's scanner array was silent. The morning air carried nothing but the dry, mineral smell of the outer rim's atmosphere and the faint metallic temps of the recycler vents. But Cole had gone completely still. Rendai felt it before she processed it. His scent changed abruptly, sharply, the way temperature drops in the seconds before a storm breaks. Whatever had been banked beneath the grief fled once, like a coal catching fresh air. Then it smoothed back down, controlled, deliberate. He stood that way for exactly 2 minutes. Krev, who had started timing things about Cole without consciously deciding to, confirmed it later. 2 minutes of absolute stillness, facing a wall, as if listening to a frequency the camp's instruments were not built to receive. Then the scanner array pinged, soft tone, the standard arrival notification, not the alarm. An inbound vessel had entered the system, descending on the standard commercial approach lane. The readout classified it as a cargo transport, registry from the Outer Rim commercial fleet. Krev checked the readout. Supply ship maybe, he said more to himself than anyone. Registries, commercial. Running the standard lane. He looked up from the panel. Cole was still facing the eastern wall. He hadn't moved toward the scanner. He didn't need to. What's the approach angle? Cole asked. His voice was exactly what it always was, quiet, flat. The voice of a man who chose words the way he chose ingredients, with precision and no waste. Krev checked. He read out the trajectory numbers. Cole looked at the scanner then. One long, reading look, the same look he had given the broken nutrient processor on the very first day, 8 seconds. Then his jaw set in a way no one in the camp had ever seen before. Not the cook, something else behind the cook's eyes. He went back to chopping. The knife resumed its rhythm exactly the same, exactly as precise, as if nothing in the world had changed. But his shoulders had shifted fractionally, and Rendai, who read emotion in parts per billion of expelled chemistry, smelled iron and cold intent. "That's not cargo," he said quietly. He did not look up from the cutting board. He did not explain. The knife kept moving. In the corner, Pick watched him with her enormous dark eyes and clutched her empty bowl to her chest, and across the camp the scanner kept pinging. Cole watched the ship from the kitchen doorway. He was still holding the knife, still wearing the same expression of flat, careful attention he applied to everything. He watched it the way you watch a thing that hasn't yet decided what it intends to be. It didn't land. It completed 2 long passes over the outer rim basin, a sweep pattern the camp scanner logged as standard orbital adjustment. It wasn't orbital adjustment. Cole knew what orbital adjustment looked like. He knew what this was. He went back inside. He finished the morning prep. He served the meal on schedule. He set Pick's bowl down before she arrived. Adjusted for the cold she never complained about. He said nothing about the ship. He said nothing about any of it. But that night, after the last bowl was cleaned and the cooking fires banked, Cole walked the perimeter. Rendai watched from the admin shelter window a small square of dim light in the outer dark and tracked his route without speaking, without moving. He covered it in exactly 22 minutes. She knew because she timed it. He paused at the northeast corner for 11 seconds, the south gate for 7, the eastern wall, the same wall he had faced that morning for considerably longer. He did not look like a restless man. He looked like a man running a security patrol and not wanting anyone to notice. Rendai stood at the window until he disappeared back into the kitchen, and then she stood there a while longer, thinking about the difference between those two things. He did it again the next night. Exactly the same route. Exactly the same pauses, the same durations, the same deliberate quiet. The cold, careful part of Rendai's mind, the part that had kept 2,000 refugees alive through 11 supply-less days, said one thing: that is a patrol. The morning after that, she went to the food storage and found it had been reorganized overnight. Not rearranged, reorganized. 3 separate caches, 2 in locations she hadn't considered, one of them partially buried beneath a removable section of the kitchen floor. Cole was at the stove when she walked back in. He glanced at her. He knew she'd found it. He said nothing. He continued cooking, the knife moving in its quiet, precise rhythm, and the smell of breakfast filled the kitchen like it always did, warm, deliberate, present. That evening he adjusted the serving schedule. Last meal moved 1 hour earlier. Cooking fires extinguished before full dark, not gradually, but cleanly, all at once. The camp's heat signature dropped off the outer rim's passive scan threshold precisely at nightfall. Rendai understood then what he was doing. He was hardening the camp quietly, systematically, without asking permission or explaining himself, the same way he'd fixed the nutrient processor, the same way he'd adjusted Pick's bowl, as if it was simply obvious and always had been. She did not ask him about it. Krev did. On the 9th morning before the camp fully woke, the Krevish security chief found Cole repositioning supply containers into a configuration that created a natural choke point at the eastern entrance. Krev stood in the doorway and looked at the containers, then at Cole, then at the containers again. His mandibles clicked 3 short bursts, the Krelish equivalent of a slow exhale. He said it quietly, without confrontation, because something about Cole made direct confrontation feel structurally unwise. "You're not just a cook," Krev said. Cole set down the container he was carrying. He turned and looked at Krev with those deep water eyes still on the surface, everything moving underneath, and said nothing for a long moment. The silence had considerable weight. "Everyone's a lot of things," Cole said. He picked the container back up. He placed it exactly where he intended to place it. The choke point closed. He made one small adjustment, then walked back toward the kitchen without further comment. Krev stood there a moment. His mandibles clicked once. Slow, thoughtful. Then, without a word, he repositioned 2 of his security team to cover the angles Cole had just created. Not because Cole asked, because the geometry was undeniably correct. For 3 days after that, something shifted in the texture of the camp. Subtle, almost invisible, if you weren't paying attention. Beings who had been sheltering near the center began moving to outer positions. The food lines grew steadier. Eyes stopped dropping to the ground. Pick had started following Cole on his daytime rounds, not the night perimeter walk, which he did alone in the dark, but the morning circuit through the camp's systems and supply stations. She walked 3 steps behind him, her enormous eyes scanning everything he scanned. He never told her to stop. He never acknowledged the arrangement out loud. But on the second morning of it, he slowed his pace by a fraction, just enough for her shorter stride to keep up without effort. She never noticed the adjustment. Rendai did. On the 11th night, Rendai received a relay message from the Valley Edge station. Camp Tessaronin, a Tessaru settlement 3 kilometers east. 300 souls had gone silent. No communication, no distress signal, no scheduled blackout, just silence where sound should have been. She deployed the scout drone immediately. Small unit, slow, barely able to cover 3 kilometers in under an hour, but it was all they had. She watched the feed on the admin terminal in the dark, Krev beside her, neither of them speaking a word. The footage came back 40 minutes later. Tessaronin was intact, every structure standing. No fire damage, no weapon scoring on the walls, no evidence of struggle. The supply containers were open and empty. The shelters were open and empty. Every living being gone. Krev's mandibles stopped moving entirely. Not the rapid, anxious, clicking, the complete, absolute stillness of something that has processed a reality it cannot immediately accept. He stared at the footage without speaking. The silence in the admin shelter was the worst kind. They weren't killed, Rendai said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. 60 years of leadership had taught her that her voice had to stay steady even when nothing beneath it would. No bodies, no blood, they were taken. All 300 of them taken. Cole was in the doorway when she turned around. She hadn't heard him arrive. He was still wearing his kitchen apron. Then she realized it was 3 in the morning, and he had not been asleep. He had been awake and watching, and the apron was simply where he always was. He watched the drone footage without speaking. Standing behind them, one hand resting on the doorframe the way a person stands when they are deliberately keeping themselves very still. He watched it to the end. Then he watched it again. His face was completely neutral. Then something happened to it, not an expression. Exactly, more the absence of expression being slowly removed, layer by layer, the way erosion works on stone. Something old surfaced underneath, very quiet, the kind of quiet that lives on the other side of a very long scream. He left without speaking. His footsteps were silent on the packed earth paths. He crossed the dark camp and disappeared into the kitchen, and the light came on in there. And then, for 14 hours, Cole Mercer did not cook. The camp felt it. Not consciously, but the way a room feels different when something warm has gone out of it. By midday, beings were drifting toward the kitchen doorway without quite meaning to, drawn by habit and need, and finding only the smell of cold surfaces and silence. Rendai checked on him at noon. He was sitting at the prep counter without moving, hands flat on the surface in front of him. The field kit open beside him. He was looking at something inside it she couldn't see, with the expression of a man in the middle of a conversation no one else could hear. She left him alone. Whatever was happening inside Cole Mercer was not something she could reach. She had learned, in 60 years of leading frightened people through impossible things, that some silences were not empty. Some silences were the loudest thing in the room. Krev spent those 14 hours doing what he could. He doubled the gate watches. He positioned his 7-person security team across the choke points Cole had built. He sent a priority distress message to the council relay. The automated response came back in 4 minutes. Emergency response, deployment, 14 to 16 hours, estimated. Standard protocol. The same protocol that had left Tessaronin with 300 missing souls, and not a single body to prove they had ever existed. Krev read the message once, then he deleted it. Cole started cooking again at hour 14. Rendai heard it from across the camp, the specific sound of his knife resuming its rhythm, precise and relentless as a clock that had decided to start again. She walked to the kitchen doorway. She stopped. The food on the counter was different. Denser, dark, compact portions, built for maximum caloric content per unit, weight, high protein, high fat, low moisture. The kind of food designed for bodies under sustained stress, for endurance, for output, for surviving things you hadn't planned to survive. Rendai had never served in a military force, but she had spent her life feeding refugees from wars, and she had seen these rations before in the packs of soldiers who arrived at relief camps after long campaigns. She knew what they were. She knew exactly what they meant. Cole stood at the stove with his back to her. The kitchen smelled different now, still warm, still real, but underneath the warmth was something else. Something like charged air before a lightning strike, coiled, waiting, electric in a way that had nothing to do with heat. She stepped inside and let herself breathe. She read him the way her species read everything, through the invisible chemistry of emotion, the truth that living things exhale before they know they're exhaling it. The grief was still there. It was always there, but something else was burning beneath it now. Not rage. Rage was hot, wild, and temporary. This was cold, precise, patient in the specific, terrible way of a thing that has made a decision and is now simply waiting for exactly the correct moment to act on it. Her species had no chemical reference for this scent. In 60 years of reading a dozen different species' emotional signatures, she had encountered nothing like it. But something deep in her biology recognized it anyway, ancient, instinctual, a warning written in the oldest language she had. She should have been frightened. She wasn't. She was, against every reasonable instinct. Something closer to relieved, the way you feel when you hear a sound in the dark and realize it isn't the threat. It is something standing between you and the threat. Something that chose to be there. "How many children are in the camp?" Cole asked. He hadn't turned around. He was portioning the rations with the same methodical precision he applied to everything, but his voice had changed, stripped of its outer layer, something harder underneath the quiet. Not the cook's voice, something older. 63, she said. Including Pick, he nodded the smallest possible acknowledgement. He added a separate portion to a smaller container without pausing. 63 units, adjusted for child-appropriate metabolic composition. He had already calculated it before she answered. He was feeding them for what was coming. He didn't know its exact shape or its exact hour, but he knew its weight. The way a man who has lived through a siege knows the sound of something tightening around him, even when the camp is quiet and the gate is still closed. Krev appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at the rations on the counter. He looked at Cole's back. His mandibles clicked, not the rapid, anxious beat of uncertainty, but one slow, deliberate sound. The Krellish expression for understanding something you would have preferred not to understand. Cole turned around. He looked at both of them, Rendai and Krev, standing in the doorway of a kitchen at the edge of the known world, and something in his face was different now. Not the cook. Not entirely. Something the cook had been standing in front of this whole time. "Krev," he said, "I need the eastern choke point covered at all hours. Rotating pairs 4 on 4 off. Start tonight." Krev's mandibles clicked once. He nodded. He left without asking why. Cole turned back to the stove without waiting for any other response. Rendai stayed. She looked at the rations. She looked at the man who had made them. She had one question, the one she had been building toward for 11 days, since he walked through the gate alone with a battered kit and repaired the irreparable in 2 hours and 40 minutes. "Who are you?" she asked. Not "what are you?" Not "where are you from?" Who, the specific, personal weight of a single word. Cole heard the difference. She could tell by the way his hands stilled just half a second before resuming their work. He knew what she was really asking. "Someone who should have learned by now," he said, "that it always comes back." He set the last portion on the counter. He looked at it, then he looked at her. "But it hasn't come yet. We still have time. Make sure everyone eats tonight. All of them. Full portions." She left him and walked back through the dark camp, past the shelters where 2,000 beings ate the most calorie-dense meal they'd had in weeks without understanding why it had changed. The scent she carried from that kitchen stayed with her through the night. At dawn, the scout drone Krev had redeployed on a wider sweep returned with new footage, not from Tesseranin, from 3 kilometers north, a second settlement. Silent, empty, structures intact, supplies stripped, every living soul taken. The exact same pattern. Krev pulled both feeds up side by side on the admin screen. 2 empty camps. One to the east, one to the north. The geometry was unmistakable, a route, moving in a careful arc through the outer rim basin. Systematic, deliberate, and their camp sat precisely in the center of it. Cole looked at the screen for exactly 8 seconds, that same reading look, the one he had given the broken nutrient processor, the one he had given the scanner. Then he reached up and untied his kitchen apron. He folded it. He set it on the counter beside Pick's empty bowl. And he said nothing at all. The folded apron sat on the counter all night. Cole did not sleep. He moved through the dark camp in silence, finishing what he had been building toward for 11 days: cache checks, choke point confirmations, a final perimeter walk every 3 hours until the sky began to change. Krev's team rotated through their watch positions without knowing Cole was also watching from different angles, covering the blind spots their positions left, the way a second pair of eyes covers a gap without drawing attention to the gap. He had done this before. Many times. Between checks, he cooked not full meals, portable rations, wrapped and distributed to the 3 caches before dawn. His hands worked automatically the way they always worked, without hesitation, without waste, without a single motion that wasn't necessary. He was good at waiting. The attack came at dawn. He heard it before the scanners did, the specific low-frequency thrum of military-grade descent engines, the kind built to suppress their acoustic signature and never quite managing it. He stood still. He counted 3 ships. He counted them by sound. 3 assault transports broke over the eastern ridge in a tight V formation, running no lights, descending fast and flat in the coordinated drop pattern of people who had done this dozens of times before. Valkyrie hall markings, a warband insignia Cole didn't recognize, but understood. The camp woke to the sound of landing struts hitting hard-packed earth. Beings erupted from shelters, 12 species, 2,000 voices, a wave of noise that crashed against the settlement walls and came back as pure, unthinking fear. The kind of fear that doesn't wait for a plan. Cole was already in the kitchen. Pick was already in the corner. She held her bowl the way she always did, two-handed, against her chest, but her eyes were different now, wide, fixed on the door. Her whole small body braced against something her mind was too young to name. Cole looked at her. He looked at the door. Outside, boots hit the ground in a sharp, organized percussion of a trained unit deploying with practiced precision. He could hear Krev's voice positions being called, the Krellish clicks of someone trying to hold a line they could not hold. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps. He picked Pick up. She was very light. Lighter than she should have been, even after weeks of his cooking, and carried her through the back of the kitchen to the panel in the floor he had installed 6 days ago without explanation. He lifted the panel. Below, the food cache, sealed containers, thermal blanket, one-way air filter, provisions for 72 hours. He had built it for exactly this moment. He had built all of it for this, the caches, the choke points, the patrols. Even when he was telling himself he was only a cook, he lowered Pick into the cache. She gripped the edge of the panel with both small hands and looked up at him with those enormous dark eyes. Frightened, yes, but not panicked. She was looking at him the way she always looked at him, with a trust so complete it required no words. That trust was the most precise, devastating thing he had ever been given. He had carried grief for 3 years and it had not broken him. But this small, silent creature who had decided he was safe, this was the thing that made his jaw work without sound. He crouched to her level. He held her gaze directly the first time he had done so for longer than a passing moment in all the weeks she had followed him through the camp. He spoke slowly and clearly, so the translator had no room to miss it. "Stay here," he said. "Don't come out until you hear me cooking again." She looked at him for a very long moment. Then she sat down in the cache, carefully, and placed the bowl in her lap, and looked back up at him. She did not look frightened anymore. She looked like she believed him. He closed the hatch over her head. He stood up. The camp outside was a wall of noise, shouting in a dozen languages. Warning shots cracking against the outer walls, Krev's voice cutting above the chaos in clipped urgent Krelish. The transport's engines were still running. They hadn't even bothered to shut them down. He breathed, he counted. Not out of habit, out of necessity. Because there was a number that lived in Cole Mercer's chest the way shrapnel lives in a body that has stopped trying to expel it. 41, the same number. The universe, it seemed, had a very specific sense of pattern. 41 days behind enemy lines during the siege of Halen 4, rations gone by day 9. 12 soldiers, 1 dead radio, and a stretch of bombed-out terrain no rescue team could cross. He had counted every single one of those days. He could still feel the weight of each one. On day 37, his medic Sergeant Usher Voss, 26 years old, the best field medic in the regiment and the only person Cole had ever met who smiled while she worked, gave her last ration pack to a wounded alien civilian they found in the rubble. She smiled when she did it, like it was simply obvious. She died on day 39 of starvation. In the specific, quiet, terrible way a body fails when it has run out of the fuel to continue, Cole had held her hand. He had not been able to do anything else. He had carried that inability with him every day since. It was the shape of him now. He moved fast and low, the way he had moved through corridors and rubble for 15 years before he picked up a kitchen knife instead of a rifle. His body remembered everything, every angle, every sightline, every calculation he had spent 3 years trying to bury under cooking smoke. He redirected the panicking crowd with 2 words and a pointed arm away from the landing zone, toward the secondary shelters on the western side. They obeyed without question, because he moved like a man who already knew what came next. That quality, in a crisis, was indistinguishable from authority. 3 Valkyrie fighters had already breached the supply corridor the eastern choke point Krev's team had held for 2 days. Now overrun, Cole moved into the corridor ahead of them. He let them enter. He let the geometry tighten around them. Then he collapsed the stacked supply equipment onto the first one. What happened next was fast. Extremely fast. And then very quiet, the specific silence that settles after something has been resolved with absolute efficiency. And the witnesses cannot quite reconstruct the sequence of events that produced it. 3 Valkyrie fighters, kitchen tools, his hands, the floor. He checked them alive, breathing, restrained with their own equipment straps, and moved on. His knuckles were bleeding from the second fighter, who had been faster than expected and landed 1 strike before Cole finished the calculation. He noted it. He did not slow down. Krev's team at the western approach watched Cole sprint across the open compound and simply could not process what they were seeing. The cook, running toward the heaviest contact, a coil of supply tether in one hand and a look on his face like the outcome had already been decided. He didn't reach the eastern wall in time. It took a shaped charge at the base, clean, professional, the kind that drops a section in one controlled collapse and leaves the frame intact. Dreth's second team came through the gap in a coordinated wave. 12 fighters, moving in 4 directions simultaneously. They were fast, and they were practiced, and there were simply too many of them. In 4 minutes, it was finished. 40 refugees corralled in the eastern shelter block Dasari Krelish, 3 species whose names Cole still hadn't learned. 11 children, Rendai standing at the center of them like she had decided that was where she belonged. A voice broadcast across the camp's public channel, deep, measured, carrying the specific cadence of someone who negotiated these transactions regularly and found them unremarkable. Commander Dreth. His galactic command was flawless. That somehow made it worse, the practiced ease of it, the complete absence of urgency. All supply stores, all medical equipment, fuel reserves, comply within 1 hour and the civilians will not be harmed. Fail to comply and they will be processed for labor operations in the Deep Rim. You have 1 hour. There will be no second transmission. The broadcast ended. The camp went silent. 2,000 beings, 12 species, the entire living weight of the compound dropping to absolute stillness in the space of 3 seconds. Then someone began to cry. Then someone else. Then the sound spread, soft and inevitable, like water finding every crack. Cole walked back to the kitchen. The pressure wave from the eastern breach had shattered 3 of the prep surfaces and scattered every bowl and container across the floor. The morning's rations, the calorie-dense field portions he had been building toward. 4 days lay crushed and spilled across the broken tiles. Blood on his hands, not his from the corridor, from the second fighter who had been faster than expected. He looked at his hands. The blood sat in the creases of his knuckles, in the lines of his palms, hands that had cooked for 2,000 people. Now doing what they had always, underneath everything, been built to do. He knelt in the middle of the wreckage, surrounded by the shattered remains of every surface he had rebuilt with these hands that were supposed to have stopped breaking things. The cooking smoke still hung in the air above him, undisturbed, as if it hadn't received the news. He closed his eyes. In the dark behind them he heard what he always heard when things collapsed. Asha's voice, not the voice she'd had at the end, thin, barely there. Her real voice, clear and unhurried. The voice she'd used when something was obvious and she needed him to catch up. Asterisk, nobody goes hungry. Asterisk, that was what she'd said on day 36, one day before she gave away the last of what she had. Not a declaration, not a promise, a statement of fact delivered the way she delivered everything, as if the universe had an obligation to honor it. And she personally intended to make sure it did. He reached for the field kit. It had landed on its side against the base of the wall, the only thing in the kitchen that hadn't moved, weighted down by the density of its contents. He righted it, he opened it. He reached past the spice containers, the thermal wraps, the nutrient compounds, past the tools, past the emergency medical kit, past the folded photograph he had carried for 3 years and never looked at directly, because looking at it directly was a thing he could not yet do, down to the bottom, to the weight he always felt there, the weight he had felt every single day for 3 years. A sealed case, matte black, impact resistant, no markings except a single line of text pressed into the composite surface. Asterisk, Earth Military. Classification, Last Soldier. Asterisk, biometric lock. 1 user, 1 thumb, no override. He had placed it there the day he walked away from everything and promised himself it would stay closed. His thumbprint opened it in half a second. The lock had never forgotten him. The case had never stopped waiting. Inside, a single communication beacon. Military grade, long range, the kind that connects to whatever remains of Earth's military infrastructure across the deepest reaches of the void. Activating it would send one signal, his code, his location, his status. Earth would receive it within seconds because whatever Earth's infrastructure had become, reduced and silent as it was, it had never stopped listening for this code. He was the last one. Earth always listened for the last one. He held the beacon. His hands were completely steady. They had always been steady in kitchens, in sieges, through 41 days without food and 3 years without purpose, and every moment in between. His hands had never once trembled. That had used to unsettle the others. Sometimes he had never found a way to explain it. He did not activate it. Not because he was afraid of what it would bring. He didn't activate it because 11 children in the eastern shelter block had not eaten this morning. Because Rendai was in that building. Because it had not yet come to the absolute last thing, and Cole Mercer did not spend the last thing until the last thing was all he had. He put the beacon in his pocket. He stood up. He looked at the wrecked kitchen, the scattered bowls, the broken surfaces, the cooking smoke still drifting through the air like it had nowhere else to go. Then he looked at the stove, still running, the morning soup still in its pot, the lid still on. He had pulled it from the heat before, the breach force of habit, or something older than habit. The lid had held. He picked the pot up, heavy, warm. The smell of it rose through the seal and hit him. Somewhere behind the sternum, the smell of food. And food smelled like the only promise he had ever made that still meant something. He walked toward the door. Krev was in the frame, wide-eyed, mandibles clicking in rapid staccato, secondary arms spread in the Krellish gesture that meant asterisk, stop, do not, under no circumstances. Asterisk. He looked at Cole. He looked at the pot. His mandibles went completely still. Cole. The translator flattened the word into a single hard syllable. There are 12 armed Valkyrie in that building, a full warband commander. You have a cooking pot. Cole looked at him. He looked at the pot. He looked back at Krev with those deep water eyes. I know, he said, and he walked out the door. Every being who could see him watched. From the shelter doorways, from behind overturned equipment, from the cracks in damaged walls, 2,000 eyes following a single man crossing the open center of a devastated camp, carrying nothing but a pot of soup and 3 years of a dead woman's promise. The 2 Valkyrie fighters posted outside the eastern shelter saw him coming and raised their weapons immediately. He kept walking. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't slow his pace. He walked toward the weapons the same way he walked toward the stove, with the complete, unhurried certainty of someone who had already decided where they were going. He stopped at the entrance. One guard pressed a weapon against his chest, close range, military grade, the kind that resolves problems in under a second. Cole looked down at it. He looked back up at the guard. Then, slowly and deliberately, he reached out his free hand and knocked on the door. The door opened. Commander Dreth filled the frame, tall even for a Valkyrie armored Coldite, carrying the particular expression of a professional who has seen everything and has therefore stopped being surprised by any of it. He looked at the human. He looked at the pot. A long silence passed between them. You, Dreth said, slowly, are either extremely brave or extremely stupid. The steam rose from beneath the pot's lid, thin and warm and persistent, curling up between them, carrying the smell of food into a building full of hostages who had not eaten since dawn. Cole held it up. "I'm a cook," he said quietly. "Can I come in?" Cole walked in. The guard at the door hadn't decided what to do about it. When Cole moved past him, the decision simply didn't arrive in time to matter. He walked through the doorway of a building full of armed Valkyrie carrying a pot of soup, and he said nothing at all. There were 4 fighters between the entrance and the hostages. All 4 saw him enter. All 4 registered the pot, the absence of any weapon, the complete lack of threat posturing, and arrived at the same place simultaneously. This did not match any known scenario. Cole walked past them. He did not glance at their weapons. He did not calculate the angles or give any indication that their presence had registered as a significant variable. He walked to the far wall the same way he walked to any table that needed to be served. They were against the wall, 40 beings, backs pressed to metal, the particular stillness of people who have been told not to move and believe it. 11 children in the center, clustered together, enormous eyes catching the dim light of the sealed building like lanterns in a cave. Cole knelt. He opened the carry kit alongside the pot flat-folded bowls he had packed before dawn, the same ones he had been using since he arrived, because he had been preparing for exactly this scenario since the 7th morning when he told Krev that ship wasn't cargo. He began to serve, quietly, without ceremony. 1 bowl at a time, in order of the children first, then the adults, the same priority sequence he used every morning in the camp kitchen because need was need, and the sequence was not something that changed based on who was watching. The first child was a Tessari, perhaps 4 years old. She looked at the bowl, she looked at him, she looked back at the bowl. Then she ate with the focused, wordless speed of something that has been hungry for a very long time and has just been given permission to stop being hungry. The smell of the soup moved through the building immediately, warm, real, dense with the specific chemistry of food made by someone who meant it, and in a sealed room full of frightened beings who had not eaten since before dawn, it moved like something physical, like a hand pressed to a shoulder in the dark. Dreth watched from the far end of the room. He stood with his arms behind his back in the command posture. His warband used the posture of absolute operational control. He had maintained that posture through 47 extractions without losing it once. He watched the humans serve soup to children. He did not move, because moving required selecting a response, and he had not yet been able to determine what response was appropriate. In 47 operations across the Outer Rim, nothing in his tactical training had produced a decision tree with a branch that accounted for this. One of the younger fighters moved, still carrying the excess energy of a soldier who hadn't yet learned that senior commanders don't act before they think. He crossed the floor and for long strides and grabbed Cole's arm. "Stop," he said. "Step away from the civilians now." Cole stopped serving. He turned his head slowly, without startle, the way you turn toward a sound you expected, and looked at the fighter. Not up at him, though the Valkyrie had a clear head of height over him, because Cole Mercer did not orient himself vertically to things. He simply looked, directly, completely. The fighter saw something in those eyes. Not a threat. Not defiance or rage or the volatile heat of someone who had made a desperate decision and was committed to it. Something colder than all of those things, something that said, with the absolute calm of a mathematical certainty, "I have already calculated exactly how this ends. Every path, every outcome, I am choosing with full awareness of all of them, to serve soup first." The fighter let go of his arm. He took 1 step back. He did not entirely understand why the human had not moved, had not spoken, had not produced any gesture his training classified as threatening, but his hand had opened and released the arm before his mind had issued the instruction to release it. Cole turned back to the hostages and continued serving. The rhythm resumed without a gap, patient, unhurried, bowl after bowl in the same deliberate sequence, as if the only thing happening in this building was a meal, and the meal was the most important thing. Rendai, sitting against the wall with the other hostages, made herself breathe slowly and read the room the only way her species could. The Valkyrie fighters smelled of adrenaline and something she identified after a moment as confusion, a sharp, acrid edge that came from a nervous system encountering contradictory data. Cole smelled of certainty. Those 2 scents had no business occupying the same space. He served the last bowl. He stood, he turned and looked at Commander Dreth across the full length of the building, that long, reading look, the 8-second assessment he applied to everything he needed to understand, and then he walked toward him, direct, unhurried, carrying the empty pot. Dreth held his ground. 20 years of Outer Rim operations, 47 successful extractions, not one campaign that had cost him more than he had budgeted to spend. He had never retreated from a negotiation table, and he had never been the first to break eye contact. He held his ground. Cole stopped 3 paces in front of him. He set the empty pot down by his feet, freeing both hands, and stood in the only posture he ever used, straight, still, completely at rest, and spoke quietly. The way he spoke, everything, as if he had all the time there was and intended to use exactly as much of it as the situation required. "I'm going to tell you something," he said. "Not who I am, what I am. There's a difference. Before you make whatever decision you're currently building toward, you need to understand the second one. So I'm going to explain it to you once." Dredd said nothing. Cole took that as permission. "My name is Cole Mercer. I am human. I come from Earth, a class 12 Deathworld. That classification means the Galactic Council's own taxonomy considers my homeworld an environment that should not produce complex life, not difficult life, not dangerous life, should not produce life at all. It produced us anyway, and it produced us the way it produces everything, by making the conditions so extreme that only the things which absolutely refuse to stop survive long enough to reproduce. He paused for one beat. Then he continued, with the same flat, careful precision. 3 years ago I was in a siege, 41 days behind enemy lines. No food after day 9, 12 soldiers, no rescue coming, no relief on the way. The kind of situation where every biological model for human survival says the organism fails at day 14, day 20, certainly by day 30. We reached day 41, not because we were extraordinary, because we had decided not to stop, and a human who has decided not to stop is a different kind of problem than anything your operational parameters were designed to handle. He let that land. His voice had not risen. His posture had not changed. He delivered it the way he delivered everything, as simple fact, stated once, for the person who needed to hear it. I will not describe for you what a human body does when it decides to continue past every threshold where biology says it should stop. I will only tell you that we have a word for it. The word is resolve. It does not have a clean translation into your language, because your language evolved in an environment that could afford exits. Ours didn't. Dreth's second-in-command shifted position. Cole noted it without looking at him. He kept his eyes on Dreth. After the siege, Earth's military drew down. My file was sealed. I was given a designation, not a rank, not a posting, a classification. Earth's last soldier. What that means, in operational terms, is this: if all other infrastructure fails, this asset remains functional. If everything else has been removed, this is what is still standing. That is what I am. That is what is standing in front of you right now. He stopped. He took one deliberate breath. When he spoke again, his voice was the quietest it had been, the particular quiet that carries further than shouting because it requires no effort to fill the room with it. The people in this building are under my care. He let the word sit. Care. In the language of Earth, that word carries a weight I do not believe your language has a direct equivalent for. It is not a preference. It is not an assignment. It is a commitment that does not have an exit clause, and it does not expire under pressure. And it did not expire this morning when your ships landed. So I will tell you what your options are. The room was completely silent. 40 hostages, 8 armed Valkyrie fighters, a warband commander who had never once in 20 years been uncertain about a situation he was standing in the middle of. You can leave now. Everything you came with, every fighter, every ship, every piece of equipment you brought to this camp, you walk out and nothing follows you. Not tonight, not on any night. You leave, and that is the end of it. That is the first option. He held the pause for exactly 2 seconds. 2 seconds, and then, or you stay. And I show you why the planet that made me classified me not as a soldier, but as infrastructure. The last piece that keeps the shape of something intact when everything else has been stripped away. The thing that is still standing when the rest is gone. Something happened to Dreth, not a thought, not a decision. Decisions are intellectual processes, arrived at through reasoning, weigable and reversible. This was older than decisions. Something deep in his nervous system produced a signal his conscious mind had not requested, and the signal was not tactical in nature. The Valkyrie had a concept buried in the oldest layer of their behavioral archive, a category of threat that predated their civilization, passed forward through evolutionary memory from a time when their ancestors had encountered things they could not outfight, outrun, or outlast. Things that operated by different rules, things that did not recognize the same finish lines. They had a word for it. It translated, approximately, as asterisk, something that does not stop. Asterisk. He looked at the human standing 3 paces in front of him. He looked at the empty cooking pot on the floor. He looked at the 40 beings on the far side of the room, some of them still holding soup bowls, still eating in a building he had secured, under weapons his warband held because a single unarmed man had walked in and served them breakfast and then politely explained what he was, and somehow that had been sufficient to make it happen. And the eyes, deep water, still on the surface, everything moving beneath. Dreth had faced council and forces, rival warband commanders, armed resistance in 17 different configurations across 20 years of operations. He had looked into a great many eyes under a great many kinds of pressure. He had no military classification for what he saw in those. The world had already ended once in those eyes. The man behind them had noted the ending and kept going. Dreth turned to his second-in-command. He spoke one word in Valkyrie. His second stared at him, stared openly, in a way that subordinates did not stare at commanders, because the word he had spoken was one that no commander of his rank had ever spoken in the middle of a secured operation in the 20-year history of his warband. He said it again, the same word, with the absolute, unambiguous intonation of someone who has made a final assessment and is done discussing it. Asterisk retreat. Asterisk. They moved fast. The Valkyrie were professionals, and professionals did not linger in positions that had been evaluated as non-viable. Weapons lowered to carry position. 8 fighters moving in organized withdrawal through the entrance. in the precise order their training dictated. Every piece of equipment they had demanded the supplies, the fuel reserves, the medical stores left exactly where it sat. The camp watched them leave. 2,000 beings from sheltered doorways, from behind overturned containers, from the gaps in damaged walls, watching 3 assault transports rise from the ground in a formation that had arrived with absolute confidence and was now departing with practiced, dignified speed. The kind of speed that wants very badly not to look like running. Krev stood in the open compound and watched them rise. His mandibles moved one slow beat, then a second, then a third. The specific Krellish expression for witnessing something that requires the complete recalibration of everything you believed you understood about how the world worked. He had no other sound for this. None existed. The eastern shelter door opened from the inside. Rendai walked out first because that was who she was, because she had been leading frightened people to the threshold before her and stepping through herself last for 60 years and stood in the daylight with transport wash dust settling around her and looked at the camp, all of it still standing, all of it still there. Cole was still in the doorway of the shelter. He hadn't moved since the last fighter exited. He was watching the sky where the transports had gone, the measured, filing look of a man storing information, not a man savoring a victory. You do not savor when you know it isn't finished. The children came out into the sunlight, 11 of them, blinking, some still holding the bowls Cole had given them. One small Tasari girl, the same age as Pick, was still eating methodical, focused, as if she intended to finish her bowl regardless of what the rest of the universe chose to do about it. Cole watched her. Something moved behind his eyes. He looked at the children. He looked at the soup remaining in the pot still warm, the morning meal that had walked into a hostage situation and ended it without a single weapon being raised. He looked at the children again. Eat, he said, quiet, final, like a door being closed gently in a house that needed the quiet. The camp exhaled. Not a sound, a physical release, felt in the chest, the full compound letting go of something it had been holding since the landing struts hit the earth before sunrise. The sun was high now. The air smelled like dust and the specific, fragile warmth of something that had come very close to being lost and hadn't been. Cole walked back to the kitchen without being asked and without explaining himself, the way he had always done everything in sequence. Without announcement, because the next task was obvious and announcing it would only slow it down. Rendai followed him to the kitchen doorway. She watched him step through the wreckage of the prep surfaces and cross to the section of floor he had installed 6 days ago. He knelt. He looked at the hatch, and then she saw something she had not seen from him before, a fractional trembling at the edge of his jaw. There for 1 second and then gone, controlled back to stillness with the same iron discipline that controlled everything else. He started cooking. From what the raiders had left behind in their haste, from the untouched caches, from the stove that still worked, he cooked in a wrecked kitchen with dried blood on his knuckles. And the sound of the knife against the board came back, the rhythm that had defined this camp's days for nearly 2 weeks. As steady and inevitable as a heartbeat. Rendai stood in the doorway and watched him for a moment. Then she said it. Because it needed to be said and she was the one standing there. The council emergency team is 9 hours out. When they arrive, they'll run biometrics on every being in this camp. Every face, every file. Cole didn't turn around. The knife kept moving. I know, he said. She waited. The knife kept moving. Does it change anything? She asked. Not challenging, not accusing. Simply asking the way you ask someone standing at the edge of something very final if they've considered where the edge is. The knife stopped for exactly 1 beat, then resumed. Not right now, he said. And that was all he said. Across the compound, in the admin shelter, Krev was watching the security footage from the supply corridor on a loop. 3 Valkyrie fighters. Professional warband, armed, trained, well-fed, 41 seconds, cold kitchen tools, his hands, 3 fighters on the floor, restrained, breathing, 41 seconds. He watched it a 5th time. Then he looked up at the ceiling of the admin shelter and sat with what he was looking at for a long moment. The cook they'd all been watching for 12 days. The cook who walked perimeter patrols at night and built choke points from storage containers and reorganized the food caches in survival-optimized positions. 41 seconds. He pulled up the council team's ETA on the relay screen. 9 hours, 14 minutes. He looked at the corridor footage. He looked at the ETA. He turned off the screen. Outside, before the last transport cleared the eastern ridge, its engines changed, pitch a subtle shift that Krev, who had spent 30 years in deep rim cargo work, recognized as a vessel holding stationary position in low atmosphere. He moved to the scanner. The ship was hovering, not climbing, hovering. For 17 seconds, one of Commander Dredd's assault transports held its position above the camp. 17 seconds long enough, with the right equipment, send a tight beam transmission on a frequency that wouldn't register on the camp's basic scanner array. Then the engine pitch shifted back. The ship rose, and it was gone. Destination, unknown. Content, unknown. Recipient, unknown. The camp's scanners had recorded a thermal anomaly lasting 17 seconds and then logged it as engine fluctuation. Krev stared at the anomaly reading for a long time. Then, from across the compound, through the walls of the admin shelter and the ruined kitchen and the still morning air of a refugee camp that had just done the impossible, the sound of a knife. Steady, precise. relentless. Coal cooking in a destroyed kitchen because a child was listening for the sound that told her she was safe. Because somewhere beneath the kitchen floor, in a sealed cache built for exactly one purpose, a small Tesseri girl sat in the dark with a bowl in her lap and her eyes on the ceiling and listened, waited, and then faint, unmistakable, the most specific sound in her small world, the knife, against the board, in its rhythm. She reached up, she pushed the hatch. The hatch moved 1 centimeter, then 2, then it lifted, slowly and carefully, the way a small creature opens a door when it isn't entirely certain what it will find on the other side. Cole was already kneeling at the edge of the panel when the light fell in on her face. She blinked up at him. She still had the bowl. She had been holding it the whole time she was down there, two-handed against her chest, because that was picked, because some habits are the shape of the people who formed them. He reached down. She took his hand. He lifted her out and set her on the floor, and she stood in the wrecked kitchen, broken surfaces, built containers, the layered smell of ash and blood, and the residue of everything that had happened in the hours since he'd closed the hatch, and she looked at all of it with those enormous, steady eyes. Then she looked at Cole. He looked back. He had nothing to say that was adequate to what the last 8 hours had been, and he suspected she had already understood everything that mattered. He turned toward the wreckage. He picked up the first broken surface. He started to rebuild. By midday, he was not alone. Beings who had nothing, whose own shelters were damaged, whose lives had been upended for the 3rd or 4th time since the war had pushed them here, appeared in the kitchen doorway, carrying pieces, moving debris, stacking what the morning had not destroyed. The equipment the Valkyrie warband had abandoned in their retreat turned out to be considerably better than what the camp had started with. Cole had it installed and calibrated before the sun cleared the western ridge. The kitchen that emerged from the wreckage was faster, cleaner, and more capable than the one it had replaced. He cooked through the afternoon and into the evening, and past the point where the camp lights came on and the outer rim stars appeared through the kitchen's single high window. He cooked the way he always cooked, without stopping, without ceremony, without any acknowledgement of what had happened. Because the next meal was what happened next. It was always the next meal. Pick returned to her corner the moment the kitchen was functional enough to have one again. She walked directly to the spot, sat down, placed the bowl in her lap, and resumed watching Cole work with the total, unblinking attention she had given him since the second morning of his arrival. As if nothing had interrupted. As if the corner had been waiting for her. The camp was alive in a way it had not been since before the supply ships stopped. Not merely fed alive. The specific quality of life that comes from being cared for consistently by someone who considers the feeding of other beings to be the most serious undertaking available to them. The camp had learned what that felt like. It did not intend to forget. The Council Emergency Response Team arrived 11 hours after the distress signal, descending in standard security configuration. 2 enforcement vessels, 1 medical transport, 1 administrative ship. The camp's scanner logged their approach at 0600 hours. Cole was already at the stove. Their briefing described a hostage crisis. Raiders confirmed in system. Camp population at risk. Council intervention required with urgency. Their scanner sweep on final approach described something different. No hostile entities detected. No weapons signatures. No active distress indicators. Camp population nominal. They landed and found a camp that had been the site of a crisis 11 hours earlier and now smelled like breakfast. 2,000 beings going about their morning routines in a settlement that had been raided, held at gunpoint, and relieved of the raiders all before the council had been able to dispatch a response. And at the stove of a rebuilt kitchen, a man, cooking, the senior enforcement officer of Valkyrie, which carried its own particular weight given the morning the camp had just lived. 3 stood in the kitchen doorway with her team behind her and looked at Cole. His back was to her, sleeves rolled up, knife moving in that quiet, bilateral rhythm. Breakfast being made for 2,000 people who had survived the night. She had responded to 41 incidents classified as hostile engagements in the outer rim over the course of her career. She had never once arrived to find the engagement had been resolved by a man making breakfast. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, established that what she was seeing was real, and went to find whoever was in charge. Rendai met them at the admin shelter. The senior officer presented her credentials and said, with the careful neutrality of someone whose briefing had stopped matching the situation she was standing in, "Your distress signal reported a hostage crisis. 40 civilians taken. Raiders confirmed in system." There was Rendai said. It was resolved. The officer looked at her scanner. No hostile entities. Camp population nominal. No casualties filed. She looked back at Rendai. What resolved it? Rendai held her gaze for a long moment. "He did," she said. And she told them everything. She started from the beginning. The gate alarm 12 days ago. The human who walked through with a battered field kit and no identification chip and repaired an irreparable nutrient processor in 2 hours and 40 minutes and asked where they kept the food, all of it in sequence. With the precision of 60 years of leadership, which was the only way she knew how to tell things. The perimeter walks she had timed from the admin shelter window. The food caches buried beneath the kitchen floor, she had confirmed their existence herself. The supply containers repositioned into choke points. The evening schedule adjusted to drop the camp's thermal signature below the passive scan threshold before dark. She described these things the way she described everything, as facts, because they were facts. Her voice was steady through all of it. Steady through the perimeter walks and the choke points and the 3 raiders in the supply corridor. 41 seconds. Kitchen tools. His hands. Steady through the breach and the hostages and the hour deadline and Cole kneeling in the wreckage of his kitchen. Her voice was steady until she reached the part about the soup. Then it was not steady anymore, because Tesserae carry memory and scent. And the scent she was carrying from that memory was something she had never produced before, a compound she had no name for. Assembled from grief and gratitude and an awe so physical and deep it had restructured something in her permanently. She stopped, she took one breath, she continued. She had been trying, since the first night, to identify what Cole smelled like beneath the grief. She had known the grief, old, iron-cold, enormous. She had known something banked beneath it, like fire in stone. The third layer, the deepest one, the thing she had no reference for, she had it now. She had lived the reference. She understood its name. She did not say the name to the council officer. Some things exist only in the chemical language and lose their meaning in translation. But she carried it, and she held it, and she knew, the scent of a being that has decided completely, without reservation, without any expectation that it will be recognized that the people in front of it are worth protecting. All of them without exception, without end. The senior officer requested the security footage. Krev provided it without comment, the full archive, chronological, all of it. The team gathered around the admin screen in silence. The corridor footage first. 3 Valkyrie fighters. Professional warband grade, armed, trained, fully equipped. The kitchen tools. Cole's hands. 41 seconds. At some point during those 41 seconds, 2 of the junior officers stopped breathing, and neither of them noticed until the clip ended. Then the compound footage. Cole crossing the open center of a raided camp carrying a cooking pot unhurried, unarmed, not glancing at the weapons visible on either side, not varying his pace by a single step, walking to serve a meal to people who had not yet been served one, through the middle of an active armed operation. Because they were hungry and it was past breakfast. The interior recording from the shelter's emergency capture unit, the fighter's hand on his arm. Cole's turn slow, deliberate, not startled. The look, the fighter's hand releasing before the order reached it. 11 children receiving soup bowls. The armed warband standing around the perimeter of its own secured operation, watching a man serve food. The senior officer leaned forward. She watched Cole walk toward Dreth across the length of the building. She watched Cole stop 3 paces in front of him. She had no audio, the emergency recorder was visual only, but she watched Cole's posture across 3 minutes of what was clearly a one-way conversation. Straight, still, unhurried, carrying no tension in any part of his body. As if everything had already been decided and he was simply explaining the decision. She watched the warband commander turn to his second and say one word. She watched the second stare at him. She watched 24 professional Valkyrie raiders leave a secured operation in organized, unrushed withdrawal. She watched them leave every single thing they had come to take. She paused the footage on Cole's face the moment during the speech where Dreth's posture had first begun to change and looked at it for a long time. Then she ran the facial recognition. The result came back in 4 seconds, not because the file was buried or encrypted or scrubbed, but because it was simply not the kind of file that anyone had cause to search for. The kind that exists in the open, waiting for the one day when someone looks. Mercer, Cole, human, age 34, homeworld, Earth, class 12, Deathworld, military service record, classified and sealed. Primary operational designation, last soldier. Status, active, below the designation. Below all the sealed service data, a note added at a timestamp 3 years old. In a file authorization she did not have clearance to read. The note read, asterisk, do not engage. Do not attempt to contain or redirect. Do not approach without explicit authorization from Earth's military command. If subject is located, do not alter his current situation. Contact Earth directly. Asterisk below that line. In a second timestamp added later, a single appended sentence that had clearly been written by someone different. Asterisk, do not try us. She read the note, she read it again. She sat with it for a moment, the particular stillness of someone who has just understood that the situation they arrived to manage is considerably larger than the briefing suggested, and that the most correct thing they can do is exactly nothing. Then she closed the file, very carefully. The way you close a door to a room you were not supposed to enter. She did not file a report to Central Command. She did not approach Cole. She did not attempt to alter his current situation in any way because the note had been written by people who understood this subject with a specificity she had not been cleared to access. And the note had been very clear. She went back to the kitchen doorway instead. Cole was still at the stove. He had not changed position since her team's arrival. Sleeves still rolled up, knife still moving, breakfast still being produced, without pause or acknowledgement. For 2,000 beings who had survived the previous day because this man had decided they would. She stood in the doorway and looked at him for a long time. He did not turn around. She turned and led her team back to the landing zone and did not look back. The council ships departed at midday. The camp watched them rise with the same held breath it had used for every ship that had moved. over its landing zone that day because some habits form in a single morning and take considerably longer to unlearn. Then the ships were gone, and the sky was clear, and the camp exhaled. Evening came the way it always came at the outer rim gradually, the sky pulling through its range of amber and gray as the sun cleared the eastern ridge, the temperature dropping fast once it did, the camp lights warming up one section at a time until the settlement glowed from inside like something that had decided, against all available evidence, to remain alive. The kitchen smelled the way it always smelled in the evenings, now layered and warm and complex, built from 12 species metabolic requirements combined into something that shouldn't have worked from a shared ingredient pool and worked anyway, because Cole Mercer had read a medical registry in 12 minutes 12 days ago and had not forgotten a line of it since. Cole was at the stove. He had been at the stove, with the brief intervals that were unavoidable, for the better part of 16 hours. Sleeves still rolled up, the knife still moving. The evening meal coming together the way it always did, with the particular patient care of someone for whom feeding people was not a task, but a practice, not a job but a form of prayer. Pick was in her corner. She had not moved from it since the kitchen had a corner again. She sat with her back to the wall and her bowl in her lap and her enormous eyes on Cole's hands, tracking the knife's rhythm the way she had tracked it since the second morning of his arrival, the same total attention, the same absolute stillness, the same quality of watching that suggested she was not simply watching but memorizing. Rendai paused in the kitchen doorway on her evening rounds and looked at the two of them, the man at the stove and the child in the corner, and understood that this had become the camp's center of gravity. Not the shelter blocks, not the medical station, not the admin shelter. This kitchen. These two, this ritual of cooking and watching that held the shape of something the camp didn't have a word for but recognized as essential. Krev stopped beside her for a moment. His mandibles clicked once. The slow single beat she had learned over 12 days meant, I know, I feel it too. There is no word for this in either of our languages, but it is real, and it matters, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. She nodded. They stood there for one shared moment. Then Rendai moved on, because 2,000 people still needed things from her, and the world did not pause for the moments that deserved it. The kitchen was quiet. The stove hummed at the frequency of something calibrated correctly and maintained with care. The knife moved against the board in its rhythm, the same rhythm it had held for 12 days. The rhythm the camp had come to organize itself around without consciously deciding to. Cole cooked the smell of it built in layers in the warm air. Pick watched him. She watched the back of him, the rolled sleeves, the steady hands, the particular way he stood at a stove like a man who had found the one thing he was sure of and intended to stay in front of it. She had been watching him for 12 days without speaking. She had not spoken to anyone in 3 months. She looked at the back of him and then she opened her mouth. Papa. One word, small and rough at the edges, the way a voice sounds when it has not been used in a long time and is not fully certain it still works. One syllable, but it carried the weight of everything a small being can load into a word that means, you are mine and I am yours and I have decided I am not afraid anymore and I would like you to know that I have decided this. Cole's knife stopped. The board went silent. The stove hummed on, indifferent, the way the universe does when something important is happening inside it. The word hung in the kitchen air, present, undeniable, changing the quality of everything it touched. His jaw worked. His eyes stayed on the cutting board. They stayed there for a long-held moment. Then he reached down, without turning. His right hand, the one that had been steady in kitchens and sieges and corridors and 41 days of starvation and 3 years of silence, moved down and found the top of her head. Gentle, careful, that way you touch something so important that carelessness is simply not a category that applies to it. Yeah, he said. The word came out rough, pulled across something in his chest that had not been fully opened in 3 years and was not fully open now, but was open enough, just enough. For this year, I'm here. And the knife did not resume for a long moment, and the stove hummed on, and the kitchen held both of them in it. The kitchen smelled like smoke and warmth and food and something that Tassari had no name for, yet but would carry in their chemistry from this night forward as a new marker. A new reference, indexed under a species that had come from a world so violent the Galactic Council classified it as a Class 12 Deathworld, a species that had survived that world and then, against every reasonable expectation, gone out into the universe and done this with what they had learned there. The Class 12 Deathworld, the planet that built endurance into biology and made survival indistinguishable from stubbornness. The place that produced, as its final military asset, a man who responded to a siege by making soup. The galaxy would need some time to understand this. It would simply have to take that time. Later, after the last bowl was served and the camp had settled into the deep quiet of the properly fed, Cole stood at the dark kitchen window and looked out at the eastern ridge. Just for a moment. The ridge where Dreth's ships had cleared the horizon, where a transmission had been sent on a frequency no scanner in this camp had been built to detect. He looked at it for a moment, then he turned back to the stove. There was tomorrow's prep to begin. Earth's last soldier never filed a report, never activated the beacon that had sat in his pocket through all of it, never once told anyone what he had done, because to Cole Mercer, what he had done was not a military operation. It was not a campaign, or a rescue mission, or a tactical engagement. It was not any of the things the council team's footage would eventually be filed under. It was Tuesday. A man who had survived a siege had found a camp that was starving and had started to cook. A child who had stopped speaking had found a corner. A warband commander who had never retreated had retreated. It was Tuesday, that was all it was, and it was enough. But somewhere across the void, across the vast, cold, indifferent distance of the stars, Earth knew. Earth always knew. Because the thing about the last soldier, the thing about the final piece of infrastructure, the thing about the element that remains standing when everything else is gone is this: he is never truly alone. The planet that made him has never stopped listening for him. It was listening now. The story of Earth's last soldier was far from over. The galaxy had barely begun to learn what it had encountered in that outer rim kitchen, what it meant. What came next, what humans do when they decide that someone is family and the universe tries to take that someone away. If you want to be there when the next chapter begins, when the stars find out what that really means, you already know what to do. The Void Ascendants will be here, and so will Cole.